This portion of the John Fredericks Show is brought to you by Hargrave Military Academy. Attend an educational and informative open house event at Hargrave Military Academy in Chatham, Virginia. For more information, visit online at hargrave.edu. Hargrave Military Academy. Build his future.
Joining us now is Guy Taylor. He is the chief correspondent for the State Department for the Washington Times. And we asked Guy on the show today. He's a great writer, and he had a rather compelling analysis of the Assad, what I'm calling the Assad deal, and it was titled the article, which you can get today in the Washington Times. Just go to WashingtonTimes.com. Guy Taylor, deal with Russians legitimizes Assad, raises prospect of partitioning Syria. Great to have you with us, Guy.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me on.
Now, in your analysis, basically you're saying in your news analysis, as I said, that based on the people that you talk to, that the deal that we're going to make with the Russians on putting the cache of chemical weapons that Assad has under international control, so to speak, legitimizes the Assad regime, right?
Sure. I mean, I think that I was just trying to unpack this a little bit because things moved so quickly last week. I mean, it was a very hectic series of developments where we went from a possible imminent airstrike to now this sort of this international diplomacy deal that it seemed like the Obama administration sort of fumbled into, regardless of what you think of it. The thrust of my story is that by sitting down at the table with the Russians now, the administration has really moved towards legitimizing Syrian President Bashar Assad, which is actually a major shift from a few months ago when the standard line out of the White House and the State Department was that Assad must go. He must step down. And the point is, how can you negotiate with someone over something like securing and destroying their chemical weapon stocks when you're also saying, hey, we want your head? And the answer to that is you can't. So there's also kind of a wider ramification to legitimizing Assad, and that's something that despite these threats of a punitive U.S. military strike on Syria, the Obama administration has actually been quietly telegraphing for the past few months, and that's this idea that Assad might actually be able to retain some power in Syria if a successful political peace negotiation is able to be achieved during the months ahead. If you read the administration statements closely, you'll see that about 2 months ago, the White House started saying things like, we don't think Assad will ever rule all of Syria again, rather than, Assad must go. And that means that the administration is actually open to this idea of a future partition of Syria where the current president would likely hold on to Damascus and possibly a few other suburbs around Damascus with the existing Syrian military, and that these controversial rebel fighters would end up taking the north of the country in some kind of a peace deal negotiated either through the United Nations or between Russia and the United States and Syria.
Based on your following this, Guy, there's no question there's been a change in tone in the administration from Assad must go to, well, we can live with Assad to some extent. What do you think was the genesis of that policy change? Subtle,
well, look, I think
subtle as it may be.
A lot of people in the Washington pundit mill have immediately jumped on this and said, oh, okay, we got taken by Moscow and the Russians are beating us around. And, yeah, I mean, you're going to look at John Kerry and Barack Obama and say they clearly looked like they didn't have a plan last week. However, I think if you're looking for why they're doing this sort of fly by the seat of their pants approach, you got to consider that a week ago, the Russians hadn't even admitted that Bashar Assad had chemical weapons, let alone that the international community should secure those weapons. So I think the White House and President Obama, John Kerry really driving it, have said, well, it doesn't matter how bad we look at this point. We want to get the Russians to the table. And if that means that we've got to play ball with this guy that we're accusing of of using chemical weapons, Bashar Assad, then that's what we do. So I think, I've heard some of the other guests on your program say this. I think, this is like a wait-and-see situation. The ball is really now in the court of the Russians. Are they going to be able to deliver on the really ambitious timeline of this agreement, this deal that was inked in Geneva over the weekend, which says that the Syrian president has got to come forward now in the next 7 days with a comprehensive list of all the weapons, the chemical weapons that his government has, as well as where they are. And I think that's, this is going to be fun to watch. I think fun is, sorry to use that word.
Right.
It's a really dicey and delicate and sad situation with the killing going on in the Middle East right now. But I think the ball is in the court of the Russians, and the Obama administration realized it needed to put it there because the Russians have the most influence over this particular Middle Eastern president.
Here's my question, and I've been asking this basically all morning. The objective, as we understood it, of the Obama-inspired military strikes against the Assad regime for the deployment of chemical weapons against his own people, the objective of that was not to take the Assad government out or not to change the balance of power in the Syrian conflict, or so not stated as such. The objective was to deter or eliminate the possibility of Assad utilizing chemical weapons in the future, right? I mean, that was the object.
I think therein lies the reason that Barack Obama had so much trouble getting support for this. That's absurd. I don't understand how the United States military can launch U.S. military hardware. The U.S. doesn't do light strikes in a situation. I know there are a couple of examples of the Clinton administration doing very strategic surgical strikes in Afghanistan. I know there are examples now of the use of drones in the Middle East for very targeted strikes. But I just don't see how the U.S. military launches a serious military strike, no matter how small John Kerry or Barack Obama say that it's going to be, without tipping the scales of the Syrian civil war. It's ridiculous to think that by taking out artillery, weapons delivery systems of the Syrian military, that's not going to completely tip the balance in the favor of the Syrian opposition. And that's one of the reasons why the Syrian opposition, which is some fighting for democracy in Syria, but it's also really marbled through at this point with hardline, Al-Qaeda-linked Islamist fighters. These people are very angry that the White House stepped up and said, we're going to strike back after this chemical weapons usage, but now is not striking back. There are actually really big protests in a few Syrian cities this weekend where people were saying things like, not with, if Obama's not going to help us, we're going to go with Osama, which is a reference to, look, if the United States isn't going to help in and help this opposition, this opposition is going to turn even more hardline Islamist going forward.
Right. And Guy, to go back, though, the objective, the stated objective, and as you aptly just said, it didn't make any sense anyway, but the stated objective was that the Obama administration didn't want to see these chemical weapons further deployed. Well,
I think the Monday morning quarterback view of that is that the administration was able to make credible threats, or try to make credible threats of U.S. military intervention at a time when not only Americans don't want that, but the entire world does not want that. And the threat of it seems just to have inspired the Russians to come to the table and say, we will work with you. So, look, I think it has been a little bit hard to watch the Obama administration conduct its foreign policy towards Syria. It seems like it's been all over the map for the last 2 years. But in this case, John Kerry said this, look, the threat of force seems to have inspired some kind of international cooperation now. And what you saw in reaction to this weekend's deal out of Capitol Hill in Washington are about 25 statements from lawmakers, senators, reps on both sides, the Democrat and the Republican side, saying in order for this to work, the United States needs to keep up its threat of a military strike.
Right. And the fact that we're going to possibly get the same objective, which is deter or stop Assad from utilizing chemical weapons in the future, via the Russians. I guess my question is, what difference does it make, to get back to what Hillary Clinton said? What difference does it make who's at the chess table moving the pieces for the Obama administration if we get the result that they set out to do anyway, right?
Well, I think in this case, it's actually a really good question, because you have to look at this and say, what is the greater strategic interest for the United States in Syria? I mean, I understand that geographically Syria sits in a vital corner of the world. It's right next to Turkey. It's right next to Iraq. It's right next to Israel. It's near Saudi Arabia. It's between Iran and Israel. Other than its geographic placement, it's not as if the United States has some major economic interest there. Syria is not a big oil producer. There's not any real driving geopolitical strategic reason for the United States to be deeply involved in Syria. So yes, I think if you're looking at this and you say, how can we help resolve the killing in this conflict in any way possible, it really doesn't matter how we get there, or whether Obama can stand up and say, I did it, or the Russians did it. The real interest here is trying to end the bloody civil war in Syria. The other problem here, though, is that the administration has really latched onto this idea that the Assad government and forces loyal to Syrian President Bashar Assad used chemical weapons. And regardless of where you stand on international law or anything about the United Nations, the use of chemical weapons is a trigger that's very scary for leaders of the current world order.
Right.
Because if it goes without some sort of retaliation from the powers that be, it sets a dangerous precedent going forward in little wars that are burning in about 7 or 8 corners of the world right now. Because the making of sarin and other basic chemical weapons it's not like making nuclear weapons. It's not that hard to do. Regimes can do it. So to say, oh, well, it can be used on people without having Moscow and the United States or Beijing or Delhi or other major world powers at this, or France or Britain or Germany, step up and say, it can't be done, we're going to lock down and stop it, it sets a dangerous precedent. And that's been the argument of the Obama administration for the last 2 weeks.
Guy, we're out of time. We really want to thank you for joining us today. Guy Taylor, Chief State Department Correspondent for the Washington Times, had a great news analysis on Sunday. Deal with Russians legitimizes Assad. I'm telling my audience, this is a must-read, and we don't say this too often. Go to thewashingtontimes.com. Guy Taylor. Hey, Guy, we want to thank you for your time today. We'll
Thanks so
have
much
you
for
back.
having me on. Happy to do it.